Hey everyone, when you think of Florida, you probably picture theme parks, maybe some beaches, right? But what we're gonna do today is tell the story of how a swampy, kind of forgotten peninsula became an absolute global powerhouse. We're diving deep into the wild history of Florida, a state that's been shaped by clashing empires, massive hurricanes, and just relentless ambition. So let's just kick things off with a pretty surprising fact. Florida is now the third most populous state in the entire country. Yeah, it actually surpassed New York way back in 2014. For a place that was for a long time considered a remote, swampy backwater, that is just a staggering transformation. And that really brings us to the big question for this whole explainer. How in the world did this happen? How did this remote peninsula, fought over by empires and pretty much ignored for centuries, turn into one of America's most influential states? Well, to find out, we've got to go way back to the beginning.
So here's our roadmap. We're going to start with the land itself and its very first peoples, long before it became a battleground for competing empires. Then, we'll track its pretty rocky path to statehood, look at the wild boom and bust cycles that defined it and its explosive transformation into the mega state we know today, before finally looking at the storms on its horizon.
Okay, so our story begins long before any state existed, on a landmass that has been in motion for hundreds of millions of years. You see, Florida's human history is really built on a very ancient geological foundation.
This slide really puts that massive timeline into perspective. Geologically, Florida started out as part of the supercontinent Gondwana, down near the South Pole. It wasn't until about 30 million years ago that this low-lying island, which geologists call Orange Island, finally popped up out of the sea. And human history here? That's even more recent. The first people, the Paleo-Indians, they arrived during the last ice age, at least 14,000 years ago.
And these first Floridians were just incredibly adaptive. Down south, you had groups like the Calusa, who built these complex societies sustained by the rich estuaries, and they did it all without agriculture. By the time Europeans showed up in the 1500s, Florida was home to over 350,000 people. But tragically, that contact brought devastation. New diseases and brutal slave raids from the English colonies to the north just decimated these populations, wiping out entire cultures.
The arrival of Europeans kicked off a totally new era, turning Florida into a strategic pawn in a centuries-long imperial chess match. For Spain, France, and Britain, if you controlled this peninsula, you controlled the vital shipping lanes to the New World. It was prime real estate.
And this timeline just perfectly captures that constant upheaval. The Spanish explorer Juan Ponce de Leon claimed the land for Spain in 1513. He named it La Pascua Florida, which means Festival of Flowers. Then Spain established St. Augustine in 1565, the oldest continuously inhabited European settlement in the U.S. But as you can see, control was anything but stable. Power flipped to Britain, then back to Spain, before it was finally handed over to the United States.
And what's really key to understand here is that not all colonial rule looked the same. Spain's primary focus was military and missionary, forts and missions to protect their treasure fleets and convert the native population, but not a whole lot of settlement. The British, on the other hand, during their brief 20-year rule, had a totally different playbook. They actively encouraged people to move there, build roads, and really started to develop an agricultural economy, laying a foundation for future growth.
Now, during Spanish rule, something truly remarkable and historically significant was established. The Spanish crown offered freedom to slaves escaping from the British colonies to the north on the condition that they converted to Catholicism. This led to the founding of Fort Mose, just north of St. Augustine, the very first legally sanctioned free black community in what would become the United States. It was a beacon of hope, and as you can imagine, a major point of friction with the British. So after the American Revolution, Spain got Florida back, but its grip was, it was weak. And this brings us to the beginning of American control, which was a turbulent period of frontier justice, brutal warfare, and the difficult birth of a new state. This quote from then Secretary of State John Quincy Adams just perfectly captures the American perspective at the time. Spain couldn't control the territory. It had become a refuge for escaped slaves and a base for Seminole raids into Georgia. Adams basically argued that because Spain couldn't govern the place, the U.S. had to step in.
And here's how it all went down. In 1821, the U.S. officially acquired Florida, but the pressure from American settlement led to the Second Seminole War, a brutal 7-year conflict that cost the U.S. government a fortune and resulted in the forced removal of most of the Seminole people to the west. It was only after this that Florida had a clear path to being admitted as the 27th state in 1845.
And this visual, it makes it starkly clear what that new state looked like. On the eve of the Civil War, Florida's economy was built entirely on the plantation system. By 1860, 44% of the population, almost half, were enslaved African Americans, and it was their labor that fueled the big cotton and sugar plantations of North Florida.
Okay, so after the Civil War and Reconstruction, Florida enters this period of just dramatic economic swings. This was the era of railroad tycoons, speculative madness, devastating natural disasters, and ultimately, economic ruin. The real key to this timeline is the sequence of events. In the late 1800s, you have magnates like Henry Flagler building railroads all the way down the state's east coast, opening it up to tourism and development. This set the stage for the absolutely wild Florida land boom of the 1920s, where property prices just went to the moon. But the whole dream came crashing down with a 1-2-3 punch. The Great Miami Hurricane in 26, the deadly Okeechobee Hurricane in 28, and then finally the stock market crash of 1929.
But from the ashes of the Great Depression came the Florida we recognize today. The post-World War II era triggered the state's most profound transformation, turning it from a southern backwater into the dynamic, powerful megastate it is now.
Just look at these numbers. Seriously, this is the story of modern Florida in one single chart. From under 3 million people in 1950, it rocketed to 16 million by the year 2000, and it just kept climbing. This wasn't just growth, this was an explosion. So what caused it?
The key to understanding this explosion is seeing how all these different forces hit at the exact same time. Suddenly, air conditioning made the brutal summers bearable. New interstate highways made travel a breeze. The space race created a high-tech industry on the Space Coast. Walt Disney World came along in 1971 and just supercharged tourism. And of course, the Cuban Revolution led to waves of immigration that fundamentally reshaped South Florida.
And Florida's new status as this populous, diverse, and critical swing state was cemented on the national stage in the most dramatic way you could possibly imagine. The entire 2000 presidential election came down to a handful of votes right here in Florida, showcasing its newfound and often very unpredictable political power.
And that brings our history right up to the present day. While the state continues to attract new residents with its sunshine and opportunities, it also faces some immense challenges, many of which are rooted in its geography and its own rapid growth.
You know, living in paradise comes with a price. This table shows the staggering and escalating cost of hurricanes. From Hurricane Andrew back in '92 to the devastation of Ian in 2022. The financial and, of course, the human cost of these powerful storms is a constant and growing threat to the state's future.
When you really look at it, Florida's history is one of constant transformation. From ancient migrations and colonial conquests to booms, busts, and massive population growth. It really leaves us with a final question. In a future that's going to be defined by a changing climate and shifting demographics, what will Florida's next great transformation be?
We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into Florida's fascinating history. For more stories just like this one, you should definitely check out our U.S. State Histories playlist. And to make sure you don't miss our next explainer, go ahead and hit that subscribe button for notebook summaries. Thanks for watching.